Um, some of you are students of history, and you've either studied it. Some of you maybe even, it's going back a little ways now, but some of you may remember FDR's New Deal. Remember that? So the United States was in the worst depression in its history, and things weren't getting any better, and so FDR, he comes into power, and he creates all this legislation that's meant to stabilize the banking industry and to help bail out farmers and to create, a social safety net. Now fast forward about 30 years beyond that. Now we're in the 1960s, 1964, and then now it's Lyndon Johnson who is president. And Lyndon Johnson saw lots of social problems. He saw the problems of poverty and racial inequality and the lack of civil rights. And so he makes a speech in Ohio, I think it was in 1964, and he lays out his vision for what he called, do you remember what it was called? The Great Society. And it was this picture of a world where all the social ills and social problems would be fixed, and everyone would be getting along better, and the society, all the problems would be eliminated. You go a little beyond that, and then you get something I think that's a little more well-known, Make America Great Again, right? And it lays out this vision of what the world could look like and what society might look like by returning to former greatness. And of course, everybody knows who came up with that, right? That was Ronald Reagan, right? You knew that, right? That's not a new idea. I hope you all knew that anyways. Now, that was 1980. He was running a campaign against, I think it was Jimmy Carter, and that was his campaign slogan. Now, I am not commenting one way or the other on were these good programs or bad programs, were they effective, were they ineffective. That's for historians and politicians and other people to debate. But my point in all of that is to lay out this tendency that we have to envision this all the problems in our world and all the social ills and social issues and problems, and then this tendency that we have to be very, very optimistic about how we can fix it all. How we can repair all the problems in our society, whether they be racism or whether they be poverty or whether they be, unemployment or whatever else. And we have this sort of unbridled enthusiasm and this optimism that we can fix it. Whatever the problem might be, we can fix it. Now the problem with that approach, that sort of optimism and enthusiasm and sort of self-confidence is that, well, it usually doesn't quite work the way you envision it. I know here in the Pacific Northwest, we're particularly sensitive to social problems and social needs, right? I mean, I would describe that as one of the qualities of what the culture is like here. We pay attention to social issues and social concerns. And as we notice these and as people pay attention, there's also sort of this desire to fix all these problems, all these social issues. Right now, I think it's in the city of Portland. It might be Multnomah County. I don't remember which, but there's a kind of a program that they have in place that says we're going to get rid of all traffic fatalities. And they have a target year. I think it's like 2021 or something. I could be wrong on the details. But the idea is, we've got this problem of too many people dying on the roads, and we're going to fix that. We're going to solve that problem and eliminate all traffic fatalities by the year, let's say, 2021. Now, that sounds like a great idea, but you realize what begins to happen. Reality begins to set in. Right? Like pretty soon you begin to realize that the numbers aren't trending downward, but they're kind of leveled off, and they might even be increasing a little bit. And so there's this initial wave of enthusiasm. We're going to fix this problem. And then reality sets in, and people begin to get frustrated, and they begin to get angry. And then if that keeps going, that frustration and anger turns into a sort of cynicism. Like maybe we can't fix this problem after all, and like the world is hopeless, and we can't, whatever program you might use, right? Whether it's Great Society or the New Deal or whatever else, it's sort of this optimism gives way to reality and to cynicism and to maybe a feeling even of hopelessness. Now, at this point you're wondering, what does all of this have to do with the book of Daniel, right? What does this all have to do with the passage that we read? And the answer is we need to kind of take a running start to what we looked at this morning. If you have your Bible still open, I want to put this in the context by taking you back to Daniel chapter 10, verse 1. Daniel, the last section of Daniel really is one large section. It's all Daniel. It's Daniel chapter 10, 11, and 12, and it all kind of hangs together. And to get the context of that, I wanted to show you again. Daniel chapter 1, we read that in the 3rd year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel. Now that date might not mean a whole lot to us, but if you were a Jewish person reading this for the first time, that date was a major milestone. Cyrus was a new king who had come to power, and the first thing he did when he took office was he signed legislation that allowed all the Jewish people who had been in exile for 70 years, it allowed them all to go home. So they could go back to their cities and their communities and their towns and their villages, and they could begin rebuilding. And they had these grand visions of communities that were going to be put back together, and the city of Jerusalem, the dwelling place of God, was going to be repaired, and the wall was going to be built back up again, and most importantly, the temple was going to be restored. It was this optimistic, hopeful vision of the future for the Jewish people. And the people were filled with excitement. They were filled with hope that this time things were going to be better. This time things were going to be different. God was going to come back and dwell among his people again, and the communities were going to flourish, and the cities and the towns were going to be thriving once again, and God would be in a restored relationship with his people again. But it didn't take very long until reality came crashing down. See, the people started this rebuilding project, and they'd only been at it for a few months, and some of the neighboring nations and cities and towns began to cause trouble. They began to harass the Jewish people as they're doing their work. And the Jewish people are getting frustrated, and they're getting discouraged. And by the way, we can kind of follow that timeline forward, and we get to the point where the temple is finally finished. And this was supposed to be a great moment in Israel history, but it was really bittersweet because it turns out the temple, well, there were some people there that remembered the first temple. And when they see the rebuilt temple, this place that was supposed to be thriving and alive, it was such a small temple, and it paled in comparison. And so there were a lot of people weeping with sadness because this great dream, this great vision that they had just never came about. And so it's into that context, that sort of optimism, but that's starting to turn into discouragement, that God gives Daniel one final vision. And that one final vision is traced all through chapters 10 and 11. And as you know, we didn't read that all this morning because it is lengthy, but it'd be a good thing, if I can give homework, that's what I would tell you to do. Go and read all of chapters 10 and 11. It's not the easiest text in the Bible that you'll read, but the gist of it is fairly straightforward. It's that for many, many years after the people returned to Jerusalem, there would be conflict and wars and violence, and it goes into the details of the Egyptians and then the Greeks and the Romans rising to power and causing trouble for God's people. Right? Chapters 10 and 11 describe a future for God's people filled with wars and persecution and people making trouble for God's people. And you see that in our text. If you look with me now, Daniel chapter 12, verse 7, you read this line about the power of the holy people has finally been broken. Now, scholars debate and discuss exactly what that means. There's different nuances to it, but I think the best understanding it is this idea that the power that God's people have is finally going to be crushed. Life is going to get very difficult for God's people. They're going to be oppressed. They're going to be persecuted. It's going to at times feel overwhelming and like an incredible burden that's almost too much to bear. Now, the reason this is so important is that it tempers our view of what it means to be a Christian. It allows us to remember the reality of the world that we live in. There are some people that maybe are inclined to approach Christianity as almost as if it's a sort of make my life easier kind of thing. Like, follow Jesus and then the pain and sickness and hardship and sadness will somehow just fade into the background. If you follow Jesus, then life gets better. God will answer all of your prayers, and God will make your life a whole lot easier and free from pain and suffering and struggle and trial, right? There's sort of that tendency, and we see that across our culture today. Christianity is presented as something that makes life easier, and if you pay attention to what Jesus says, if you pay attention to what the Bible says, that couldn't be further from the truth. If you follow Jesus, you need to be prepared for the fact that life may get more difficult. You can expect that you're not going to fit in this world and in this culture. You're not going to feel at home, and people may make fun of your beliefs and your convictions to your face or behind your back. You're going to be the one that's committed to a certain ethic and a certain way of living, but that's not going to feel at home where you work or you go to school, with your family, with your friends. You're going to stand out. You're going to be different. And of course, there are places in the world where that's taken even further, where Christians are imprisoned and they're tortured and they're killed because of their faith. That's reality. So if you think that being a Christian makes life easier, then the book of Daniel is very sobering. It says no. Being a Christian actually makes life more difficult in one sense. Now, Daniel, as Daniel's seeing a vision about all of this, he asks a question, and it's a question that I suspect any one of us would ask if we were standing there. Actually, I should be more specific. The first question is not asked by Daniel. It's asked by one of these angels that's watching all of this unfold. And in verse 6, the question is asked, how long will it be before these astonishing things are fulfilled? In other words, how long is it going to be that this happens? How long is this persecution and trouble and trial and war and famine and hostility, how long is that going to go on for? And I don't know about you, but I would love to know a very specific answer to that question. Right? Circle the date on the calendar when Jesus will come back and all the pain and suffering will be over. That would help, wouldn't it? Wouldn't you like to know that? I want you to look at what the answer comes instead. Verse 7. He lifts his right hand and his left hand toward heaven. That's a way of swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Not just with your right hand, but with your right and your left hand. So affirming the truthfulness of this and emphasizing the truthfulness of this. Here's the answer. It will be a time, times, and a half a time. Well, that clears it up, doesn't it? You look down at the bottom of the page, there's a footnote that suggests maybe it means a year, 2 years, and a half a year. Here's the thing about that. The answer is not clear. This is not one of these places in the Bible where you can get a pinpoint, accurate answer to the question, how long will this last? But I want to tell you that does not mean that this number is insignificant or we should just sort of ignore it. This is a very specific number. It means, first of all, that God has a time set out. But more specifically, if you do the math, time and a times and a half of time really adds up to 3.5. Okay, 3.5, whatever, days, weeks, times, whatever they might be. 3.5. Now, 3.5 is half of 7. And we've looked at this a couple times now. The number of 7 is the number of perfection in the biblical story, right? When you read prophecy, the number of 7 is the number of perfection. And so the message here is half of perfection. This trial and tribulation and suffering and opposition and so on is not going to be allowed to reach its fullness. It's not going to be allowed to reach absolute completion. God's going to cut it off before it reaches that point where it has complete control. God is going to put an end to it before it reaches perfect fullness. God is going to stop the suffering, war, tribulation, and suffering before it reaches its fullness. So the exact date isn't important, but the message is God will put a stop to it before it can completely have its way in the world. Now, there's a little more to it. If you notice in verse 11, there's another number that's given, actually two more, and we'll get to both of them. But first look at this, because the question is answered a second time. From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Typically, that's understood to mean from the time of Jesus and his finished work until the end of time is 1,290 days. Now, you run into real trouble if you take that literally, because we're way beyond that now. So you have to, again, take it figuratively. And so you ask, well, what does 1,290 days mean? And, well, guess what? You do the math, it accounts for 3.5 years. Hey, you multiply, do all the math, 3.5 years. So why is he saying 1,290 instead of just 3.5 again, or time times and a half a time? And the answer is this: 1,290 sounds very specific. The meaning is this: God is saying to his people, you may not know the exact day, but don't kid yourself. I'm not vague and abstract. God says, I have it down to the day. I know exactly when this is going to happen. The emphasis there is on God being very specific. He has a date in mind where all the evil, sin, suffering, sickness, and pain and hardship in this world will come to an end. He has it very clearly marked, very clearly spelled out. God is not just, well, one of these days I'll get around to. No, specific. Down to the day, God has it where he will end evil in this world. Now, why, verse 11, actually verse 12 now, why does the angel say, blessed is the one who will reach, who waits for and reaches the end of 1,335 days? So if all this pain and suffering ends at 1,290 days, why do we add 45 more days onto that? Well, let me use an analogy that maybe kind of can explain this, or give a little story. My wife, most of you know my wife is a runner, and most of you also know that I am not. And so that means that if I go to one of her races and watch, I go and I don't participate. I go at the finish line and I watch at the end. And I remember there was this one race. This was back when we lived in Michigan, and it was called the Fifth Third Riverbank Run, and it takes place in like April. And this year it was really, really hot and humid, which is unusual for April. It usually doesn't get hot and humid until later on, but in this case it was really hot, really humid in April, and so the runners probably weren't preparing for that because it's usually a little cooler. And so I was watching at the finish line, and this happened numerous times where you get the runner kind of staggering towards the finish line, and you could tell they were just about done, but they wanted to get to the end. And so as soon as they hit the finish line, they collapsed. And then they had to be helped off by medics. I mean, it was kind of dramatic, and thankfully it was just, usually dehydration and everything works out well. But here's the idea, right? You set your eyes on the finish line. Okay, you might make it there, and then that's the end of it. But what the writer of Daniel, the message of Daniel is, don't just look at the date where all the suffering and tribulation and pain and trial, don't just have that as the end point. Blessed are those who look beyond that to the glory that awaits. Blessed are those who aren't just looking to that day when Jesus comes back and all the suffering is over. Blessed are those who look beyond the finish line to the glory that awaits. Because when your heart and mind is filled with the vision of the glory that awaits, then all the suffering and hardship of the present begins to take on a new perspective. Right? Paul says that nothing can be compared to the future glory, to the glory that awaits. So don't just look to that day when all the suffering of this world will end. Look beyond it to the glory that awaits. Now, so that's the first thing. Persevere by looking at the glory that awaits. The second thing, if all this is true, the second thing, what does it mean? How do we respond? Verse 9 and verse 13, the angel says to Daniel 2 times, go your way, Daniel, because the words are closed up and sealed up. And then again, verse 13, as for you, go your way till the end. It's easy to get swept up in anxiety today, and by that I mean the anxiety about looking at all that's wrong with the world. Just scroll through Facebook. Right? Have you ever noticed how people get so keyed up and so anxious, and you get the sense it's like henny penny, the sky is falling, the world is falling apart, and it's easy to get all caught up in that. No doubt Daniel could have as well, right? Daniel, wars are coming, there's going to be conflict and famine and persecution, and yet the angel doesn't say, so, Daniel, you better really get frantic and pay attention. No, he's just go your way. It's sort of this confident nonchalance, this absolute trust in the sovereignty of God, that if God is in control of all things, then we have nothing to be worried about. Nothing to be anxious about. Just go your way. Just serve, love your neighbor, fellowship with one another, fulfill God's calling, make disciples, do all the things that God calls us to do. But don't get so keyed up about the way things are in the world. Just go your way. Go your way, Daniel. Don't get so swept up in trying to figure out when is this all going to happen? What's the date? Tell me the day so I can circle it on my calendar. Nothing like that. Just go your way. Confident nonchalance. Now, Daniel himself asks a question. So the angel asks a question, when is this all going to happen? Daniel doesn't get clarity on the answer. We read that in verse 8. I heard this, but I didn't understand, so I asked a follow-up question. What is the outcome of all of this? And then again, go your way. Don't get so swept up in trying to get all the details, but then verse 10, here the angel elaborates. Many will be purified and made spotless and refined, but the wicked will continue to be wicked. Brian Chappell, who is a writer and a preacher and a theologian, he summarizes it this way. He says, God will refine the righteous and define the wicked. Refine the righteous, define the wicked. In other words, wise people learn to look at the way things are in the world, the adversity, the suffering, the hostility, and so on. Wise people look at that as God's work of refining his people, strengthening his people, perfecting them through trial. Wise people look at the world and see God's hand in places like China, where the church is being persecuted in alarming ways, and yet the church is growing stronger. Wise people learn to see that even in our country, as we become more and more further and further away from a Christian worldview, wise people learn to see that as actually God's way of strengthening his church. And that may involve winnowing his church, but strengthening his church as well. And at the same time, there's the warning. God will define the wicked. That's a way of saying that there are going to be people who do evil things, dictators, tyrants, persecutors of the church. It's happening in China, it's happening in India, it's happening in the Middle East, it's happening in North Korea, it's happening in a lot of places. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. The times that we live in will define the wicked. We will see that more and more. But what what hope is there for us? Well, that brings us back to the question that we started with and never really got around to answering, right? Well, the question of, so you start off and you see the problems in the world, and you see, whether it's social problems, whether it's problems in your own life, problems in your marriage. What is it that can fix that, right? You want to start off and be optimistic, and we can fix this, and if I just work at it a little bit, and there's sort of that pride there, but then it leads to sort of frustration and cynicism and despair, whether you're God's people in Jerusalem trying to rebuild, or whether you're living today. What can fix what's wrong with the world? Right? What can fix a broken marriage? What can fix an addiction? What can fix an ego and pride? What can fix all of these things that wreak so much havoc? And what God's people were learning, and what God is communicating through Daniel, is that if you start off on this idea that we can do it, we can fix it, we can build it, we can repair it, that's destined for failure. Because the problems are more than just broken down temples and broken down walls and broken down marriages and broken down this or that. The problems run to the very core of who we are. God says in the book of Romans, right, the wages of sin is death. In other words, the consequence of sin in this world is not just the wages of sin is a little frustration and a little difficulty and hardship. The wages of sin is death. The spiritual problem that we have leads to death. I mean, death of a marriage, death of self, and so on, but ultimately death before God. And so the problem needs much, much more than just a little elbow grease and a little determination to fix it. The problem needs new life. Now let me show you something real quickly, because this is foreshadowed here in the end of Daniel, but it's not completely spelled out, but it's here. Start first of all in chapter 12, verse 2. We didn't read that again this morning, but I just want to draw your attention to it because it comes back in the end of chapter 12. Chapter 12, verse 2, a picture of the end. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life and others to shame. There's the picture there that Daniel is beginning to see, that at the end of time, there will be a resurrection. All will be brought back to life again. And then again in verse 13, Now the angel addresses it to Daniel and says it about Daniel. As for you, go your way till the end. You will rest, meaning you will die, and then at the end of the days you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. It's there, but you might miss it if you don't look carefully, but that's the promise of resurrection. God's ultimate and final answer to the problem of sin and evil and destruction in this world is not go at it and try a little harder, it's resurrection. So when Jesus comes into this world, what does he do? One of the things he says is, I am the resurrection and the life. So Jesus comes into this world and he goes down into death. He experiences that curse. But then 3 days later again, he rises again and walks out of that tomb and destroys the power of death. And friends, we know and believe that what happens to Jesus happens to us if we are in Christ. So we share in that resurrection. We share in that resurrection from the dead. That means that God, through Jesus, deals with our deepest problem. He removes our sin. He releases the grip that death has over us. And he sets us free. That's the answer to these deeper problems. Now, in the meantime, we're going to experience tribulation and suffering. The world is not going to be an easy place. But our greatest enemy has been destroyed. Now, one of the themes in the whole book of Daniel is the theme of really who's in charge? Who is sovereign, right? Is it King Nebuchadnezzar, who builds this big statue and wants everybody to come and bow down and worship him? Is it King Belshazzar, who throws this big feast and says, everybody look at me. Look, I don't need to be humble. Is it King Darius, who kind of is tricked into it, but he makes a law, says, you can't pray to anyone but pray to me. Right? That's that whole conflict. Who's in charge? And every time the answer comes back, God sends the message, I am sovereign. I'm in charge. I am Lord. I am over everything. Trust in me. And that's the message that the book of Daniel concludes with. God is sovereign even over death. God has defeated even death. Right? So what's going to fix our world? Elected leaders, politicians, new law, new legislation, new social programs. All those have their place. And, we just debate and discuss how those should be implemented. But you know what? Those things can't fix what's wrong. What can fix what's wrong is Jesus Christ, the resurrection and the life. And he has done that. And one day, we too will rise. And we will stand before him. And we will live with him forever. Now, we're coming to the Lord's table here in just a few moments. Now, a lot of times when we think of communion, we think about what it is to look backwards at what Jesus has done, right? I mean, it's remembering. Remember and believe. And so, yes, remember, but the Lord's Supper also says, look forward. The Lord's Supper is a meal that says, okay, you eat this today, but it's like a foretaste. It's meant to prepare you because one day you're going to sit down with Jesus again and you're going to eat with him, not just the small meal of the bread and the cup, but a feast. And you will, with Jesus, forever be in the New Jerusalem, the new city, where his authority and his reign will be absolute and certain and guaranteed and fully realized. So I invite you this morning as we come to come with that in your heart and in your mind. Looking backwards, yes, at what Jesus has done, but also looking forward at what that means and what that guarantees for us. We come in hope that the pain and tribulation and suffering of this world has an end date. You may not know what it is, but God knows exactly the date. He will not let evil run its full course. And one day we will live with him for eternity. Let's join together in prayer.